When it comes to strength, there's a law. There's a law that runs underneath all of it. Underneath the careers, the relationships, the reputations people spend decades building. The law isn't about effort. It is not about talent or position or how carefully you have constructed the version of yourself the world sees. It's about structure, specifically whether the three layers that make you you, the story you tell about who you are, the way it actually feels to be you, and what you do when no one's watching. Whether those three layers are running in the same direction. When they are, you are solid. Pressure lands and distributes. The whole thing holds. When they aren't, when one of those layers has gone quiet, or gone somewhere else entirely, while the other two keep performing, there is a seam, and this seam is invisible to you, to the people around you, to anyone reading the external signal. This is not a performance problem. That's the trap. The performance can be extraordinary, and it can be running on exactly the structure that leaves you most exposed. Lydia Tarr understood this perfectly. She used it. She pressed other people's seam with precision, and she called it conducting. She had no idea she was running one herself. What the world called her genius was the same crack that took her apart. Let me show you exactly how it works. Think of any structure that carries load. A bridge, a wall, a foundation, whatever comes to your imagination. The engineering principle is the same everywhere, and it's almost dumb in its simplicity. A structure is strongest when its components are true to each other. When they are aligned, load distributes. Stress travels through the whole thing and dissipates. The moment one component changes out of true, you get a seam, not a break, not a collapse, a seam, where two things that were supposed to move together have stopped moving together. And the gap between them is now doing something the original design never accounted for. But there is something strange about a seam. The structure doesn't weaken visibly. In some cases, it even looks stronger. The components that are still aligned have to work harder to compensate. And that extra effort reads from the outside as capability, as force. The seam is widest exactly when the performance looks most impressive. And this seam does one specific thing. It concentrates pressure. Whatever lands on that structure doesn't distribute anymore. It roots. It finds the place where the components stopped being true to each other, and it accumulates there. Now for the part that matters for what we're about to look at. Two things find a seam. The first is blind. It's just load, just circumstance, just the ordinary pressure of being in an exposed position long enough. It has no intent. It doesn't know the seam is there. It finds it anyway, because that's what load does. It roots to weakness. The second is deliberate. Someone who knows how to read a structure, who can see where the components stopped being true, can place pressure with precision. It is the same seam, the same concentration, and the same disproportionate result. But now there is a hand on it. So the principle you have to keep in mind is when the layers fall out of true, pressure stops distributing and starts accumulating, and the gap becomes the most readable thing about you, even when you cannot feel it yourself. That last part is the diagnostic. When a reaction, yours or someone else, is widely out of proportion to what caused it, that disproportion is not noise. It's a reading. It's the seam showing you where it is. Watch for that in what's coming. Specifically, watch for the moment when the reaction is so much larger than the provocation that the only explanation is something structural underneath. That's your signal. Lydia Tarr is, by any measure, at the top of the music world. She's the chief conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic, one of the most prestigious positions in classical music, and one of the most male dominated. She got there on genuine genius. She's preparing to record Mahler's Fifth Symphony, the project she spent years building toward. She literally wrote the book on conducting. The external picture is clean, airtight even. And before any of it unravels, before the cancellation campaign, before the fall, there are three moments. At first sight, they don't connect. Each one has a perfectly reasonable explanation. That's exactly what makes them worth watching. Because what we built in the last section gives you a specific lens. A seam doesn't announce itself. What it shows you, before anything external arrives, is where the structure is already under stress. The thing to track is the body moving ahead of the cause. The first is Backstage at a press event in New York. Before she walks out, she's adjusting her suit, breathing slowly, deliberate, controlled. The basic pattern you learned in meditation. She touches her face, closes her eyes. Her assistant, Francesca, even hands her a pill that Lydia takes without breaking the rhythm. If you don't pay any attention, this is just stage fright. Every performer feels it. The greats just do it anyway. One is seen and nothing to see here. The second comes after a lunch with a colleague, her mentor, days later. She goes to her old apartment, lights candles, and sits at the piano. Four keys in, and she suddenly stops. She turns and looks behind her, like something is there, but nothing is. Later, in the kitchen, he once again suddenly stops. She was cutting a lemon for her tea. She moves through the apartment following a sound she cannot locate, and ends up at the piano playing in exactly the tone and rhythm of the sound she was chasing. The sound that had no source. The third is a morning run. She enters the park, moves into the trees, and hears a scream full of desperation, coming from somewhere in the woods. She runs toward it, but she cannot find anyone. No one is there. The scene cuts, and she is once again in her old apartment. She is writing something above the piano, and once again stops suddenly because she hears the chime at the door, the same as the previous scene. She opens the door, but no one is there. Three scenes, no obvious connection, each one explainable on its own. Nerves before a performance, a trick of acoustics, a long week full of stress. But this is where the lens earns its keep. She is not reacting to anything yet. Krista, her former student, is still alive. The social media campaign hasn't started. No one has moved against her. The external pressure that will eventually find her seam doesn't exist yet in any meaningful form. The body doesn't know that. The body is already bracing, already surfacing sounds that aren't there, already turning to look at empty rooms, already importing a kind of dread into spaces that have no cause for it. This system is already under stress, and nothing has touched it from the outside. This seam is not created by the pressure that eventually exploits it. This seam was already there. The pressure just finds what's waiting. And what you carry out of this, the next time your reaction arrives before the cause does, the next time your body tightens in a room where nothing has happened yet, that's not sensitivity. That's not intuition. That's the seam, surfacing before the cause arrives. So the seam was there before anything landed on it. before Krista's death, before the backlash, before any of it. And that means a change of question. It's not about what caused this anymore, but about what finds it. And why does it always land so hard? Almost everyone reaches for one of two explanations of what happened to Lydia Dar. The moral read. A powerful person abused her position, and the system eventually caught up with her. The political read. This system was weaponized. A targeted campaign dismantled someone powerful. And the takedown said more about the culture's appetite for those takedowns than it did about her. Both of those analyses share something. They both locate the cause outside. They both make the event about what was done to her or what she did to others. And they both miss the part that makes this structural rather than just tragic. This is Axiom 13 of 75. It's called the exploit. The core principle is this. When the layers fall out of true, the story you carry about who you are, the way it actually feels to be you, and what you do. The gap between them doesn't sit there waiting to be repaired. It functions. It becomes a surface that pressure concentrates in. And the amplification runs on the architecture of the gap itself, not on whoever or whatever is doing the pressing. That's my precise claim, and it's worth sitting with. The reason the moral read and the political read both miss it isn't because they are wrong about the facts. The abuse was real. The campaign was real. The culture's appetite was real. All of it lands as genuine external force. The issue is that those reads treat the external pressure as the cause of the damage, as if a synchronized person at the height of that career, hit by the same campaign, would have ended up in the same place. They wouldn't. Not because the campaign would fail, but because a synchronized structure distributes pressure. A sim concentrates it. The damage was always disproportionate to the event, which means the event is not the full explanation. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, and it should, a little, because it feels like it's shifting blame inward. It isn't. As I said, the external pressure is real. The people who pressed it were choosing to press it. None of that gets erased. What changes is the mechanism, and the mechanism is structural, not moral. Here's a physical version so you can fully get it. Picture a wall with a hairline fracture. A uniform load distributes around it, concentrates in it, and pushes it wider. Not because the load is targeted, because that's what load does. That's the exploit. The person with the precision doesn't create the vulnerability. They find it. and the pressure that runs without any person directing it finds it for the same reason. The architecture of the gap does the work, not the force applied. It's the path the structure offers. The next scene shows it directly. There's a moment, a specific moment, in a room where Lydia is very much in control, where you'll see a deliberate hand find exactly where the gap is. Not through luck, through reading. Here's the deliberate hand. Remember the second finder, the one that doesn't arrive by accident, the one that reads the structure before it presses. This scene is that finder working at full precision. Watch less for what she says and more for the sequence of moves underneath it. It's a masterclass at Juilliard. A student named Max is at the podium conducting. Lydia stops him early and asks why he came to Juilliard specifically. The question isn't random. She's already scanning. He says it's because it's the best conservatory in the country. She doesn't accept that. She says there is usually a person behind a choice like that. Who was it? She asks. He names Sarah Chang, a violinist. She makes a small joke. At this point, there is not bad intent. Max sits down. She moves through the class. Another student praises the atonal tension in the piece they have been listening to. Lydia takes the point and immediately reframes it. The question isn't whether the tension is interesting. It's what the tension is doing. What is it actually doing to me?
Good music can be as ornate as a cathedral or bare as a potting shed, so long as it allows you to answer both those questions. Max.
Then she turns to Max. Remember what I said about the body bracing before any real external pressure? Well, here you can see clearly. Before she says his name, his leg has already started bouncing. The body reads the room before the room moves. Max offers a response, halting, soft-voiced, about the composer's relationship to nature and landscape. Lydia nods. She sits at the edge of the stage and pivots. What about conducting music that actually requires something from you?
For instance, Max, why not a Kyrie? You know, like something like Bach's Mass in B minor.
I'm not really into Bach.
She presses and asks why not. And here Max gives her exactly what she needs. He says,
Have you ever played or conducted Bach?
Honestly, as a BIPOC, pangender person, I would say Bach's misogynistic life makes it kind of impossible for me.
She has the theme, so she challenges the logic.
But I'm sorry, I'm unclear as to what his prodigious skills in the marital bed have to do with B minor.
After a few moments, she calls Max up. He crosses to the piano and sits beside her. Leg is still going. She plays back slowly, deliberately, then asks what he thinks. He says she plays really well, but white male cis composers are not his thing. She reaches over and puts her hand flat on his bouncing leg. She is clearly annoyed by his response. She says,
Just not my thing.
Don't be so eager to be offended. The narcissism of small differences leads to the most boring conformity.
when he tries to find an exit, she closes it. And then the press lands at full weight.
Is that if Bach's talent can be reduced to his gender, birth country, religion, sexuality, and so on, then so can yours. What kind of criteria would you hope that they would use to do this? Your score reading and stick technique, or something else?
Then she invites the whole class to consider the composers they had been analyzing and ask them to square how any of those facts relate to the person now sitting at the piano bench. Max walks out. The contradiction worth naming isn't the one most people reach for. The argument she's making is not wrong. The case that identity-based filtering collapses on itself. That the same logic that cancels back cancels everyone, including you, is coherent and defensible. The intellectual content holds. This is not a scene where a villain delivers bad philosophy. What it is a scene where the doctrine she teaches. Music transcends the person. Sublimate yourself to the work. The artist serves the form, is doing double duty. It's about what she genuinely believes about music and the instrument she just used to locate and press a specific gap in a specific student at a specific moment. The story she carries about who she is, this selfless servant of the work, this servant of music, is exactly what makes the dominance move invisible to the room and probably to her. This story isn't just covering the doing. This story is what the doing runs on, and the asymmetry that actually matters is that she read Max with precision. She picked up the violin background, the weak voice, the identity-based rejection of the canon. She built a picture of exactly where the pressure would concentrate, and she placed it there. That is genuine competence. It required reading, timing, and intelligence. What will find her sim needs none of that. The architecture does the work, not the operator. And the thing is that you have done a version of this. You have named a flaw in someone else, about their defensiveness, about their blind spot, the way they filter the world with real accuracy, while running the identical structure yourself, with different content in the gap. Your diagnosis might even be right. It's that the gap you are looking at in them is often precisely the one you stopped looking at in yourself. Is she running the same thing? She just willed it. There are already words for what we saw in that masterclass. You already know them. Hypocrisy. Saying one thing and doing another. Narcissism. The self-serving gap between the doctrine you preach and the power you protect. Cognitive dissonance. Holding contradictory positions without realizing the contradiction. Self-sabotage. Running the behavior that undoes what you say you want. Every one of those labels is pointing at something real. The gap between what Lydia professes and what she does. That's true. The frameworks that named these things aren't wrong. What they are doing is naming the output, not the condition that produces it and keeps it running. Because what none of those labels explains is this: why the gap remains once someone sees it, why understanding it doesn't close it, why you can articulate the split in yourself with precision, name it, map it, recognize it in real time, and still be running it an hour later. That's the question this section answers. Start simple. A gap between layers concentrates pressure the same way a structural fracture does, without intent, without coordination, just because that's what gaps do. The ordinary friction of an exposed position, a difficult conversation, a professional setback, a relationship that changes, lands on whatever fracture pattern is already there. It doesn't look for the gap. It finds it because that's where load roots. That's the first label. Now add a variable. The gap is indifferent to who finds it. A deliberate hand, someone who can read where the layers have stopped being true to each other, can place pressure with precision and achieve a disproportionate result with a fraction of the force. That's what Lydia did to Max. But an impersonal load achieves the same disproportionate result with no reading, no precision, and no intent at all. The architecture does the amplifying in both cases. The operator is interchangeable. And from inside, you widen it yourself. Not on purpose, exactly. The moves you make to maintain the story layer, to protect the performance, to keep the surface coherent while the underlying layers go their own way. Those moves add load to the fracture from the inside. The gap widens on two fronts simultaneously. But the thing that makes this genuinely hard to work with is this. The structure reads stronger exactly when the seam is widest. When the performance layer is compensating hardest for what the other layers have stopped supplying. The output looks most impressive. There is no felt signal. This seam is invisible from inside the performance, and the performance is at its peak precisely because the fracture is forcing it. So when the pressure lands and produces impact that's too large for the cause, that disproportion is the signal. The moment where the structural reed could locate exactly which layer just absorbed the heat. But this is what actually happens. The disproportion gets explained, not structurally, personally. Something out there targeted you, or the conditions were always hostile, or the people around you don't understand the work. And that explanation isn't just a story. It runs on all three layers simultaneously. The story layer tightens around the narrative. The feeling layer changes toward the emotional states that confirm it. Embattled, justified, and defensive. The behavioral layer starts producing the output of someone responding to a genuine attack. The structural read arrives as a single thread against three layers of lived confirmation. Convergence beats recognition every time. Which is why understanding the pattern is not the same thing as changing it. The desynchronization is self-concealing. And this is the cruel part. The structure reads strongest precisely when the fracture is doing the most work. And it's also self-compounding. Every time the disproportion gets explained away instead of read structurally, the fracture that caused it stays open. The external pressure that just concentrated in it lands harder on the next pass, and the internal widening adds more load from inside. This cycle doesn't need coordination to accelerate. It just needs the structural read to keep arriving too late. This is what makes it an exploit rather than just a gap. Every pass without the structural read makes the next one worse. Anna Lemke at Stanford studied what happens when a reward system built for scarcity meets an environment it was never designed for. Cacti adapted across millennia for an arid climate, now drowning in a rain forest. This system met conditions it couldn't metabolize, and the mismatch amplified on its own structure, not because the abundance targeted anyone, but because the gap between what the system was built for and what it encountered was where the damage concentrated. The fracture was architectural, the pressure was impersonal, and the result was disproportionate by design. What she documented in neuroscience, Cicero watched happen on an entire civilization. The Roman Republic's constitution was calibrated for a city-state. The checks and balance, the term limits, the deliberate architecture, and then the empire it produced outgrew it. The fracture between the institutional form and the scale it now had to govern was structural. in both internal ambition and impersonal historical force concentrated there simultaneously. The seat outlasted the men. The Republic's collapse required no single tyrant because the architecture of the fracture was doing the work. The deliberate hands that pressed it and the impersonal weight of an empire that exceeded it found the same gap for the same reason. Now, Taleb named the agential version in finance. He called it the Bob Robin trait. An interested agent who understands the structural asymmetry in the system positions himself to capture the upside while transferring the tail risk onto the system itself. Robert Robin collected over $800 million in compensation from Citigroup in the years before 2008. When the tail arrived, the bank needed a government bailout. The agent succeeded on the architecture of the asymmetry, not because of who he was, but because of where the fracture was and how it distributed risk. The deliberate hand found the seam. The institution absorbed the loss. And Dalio, tracking the preconditions of civil wars and revolutions across 5 centuries, called it the classic toxic mix, a structurally vulnerable order, internally fractured, with its layers falling out of truth, on which an impersonal external shock acts. When failed harvest hit a bankrupt France with extreme inequality already built into the structure, this shock needed no intent to find the fracture. In Dalio's data, when enough structural red flags are present, the probability of collapse rises in measurable step with the depth of the fracture, not with the size of the shock. The architecture amplifies the pressure, not the pressure alone. 4 completely different domains. But in all of them, we find the same mechanic. Before we go further, a few corrections to the way this usually gets applied. Starting with the obvious one. Impersonal doesn't mean doesn't matter. The pressure that finds your seam without intending to is still real pressure. It still produces real consequences. Reading it as a structural rather than targeted is not a way to dismiss it. It's a way to locate it accurately, which is the only way to do anything useful with it. Then let's continue with the one people misuse. The structural read is not a suppression tool. When impact lands and something emotional moves in response, that movement is information. The layer diagnostic the structural read is supposed to run needs that signal. Intercepting every emotional response with "that's just a fracture being hit" before the signal has actually registered is a misuse of the framework that cuts off exactly what it needs to operate. And finally, the one most people skip. Not all personalization is false. Some pressure does carry genuine intent. Deliberate hostility exists. Targeted interference also exists. The structural read doesn't erase those. It asks whether the structural explanation is more accurate than the personal one before the personal one locks in. When the evidence clearly supports personal intent, that's what it supports. What changes with mastery is in the arrival of pressure. The fractures between layers still attract load. The gap still concentrates impact. What changes is the speed at which the structural read arrives alongside the personal explanation, until it reaches comparable speed. In the interpretive monopoly, the personal explanation held by default dissolves. That speed is what Lydia never developed. The asymmetry that let her read Max seem with precision. The reading that took intelligence and timing and genuine craft did not transfer inward. What found her seam needed none of that craft. It just needed the gap. And the gap was there. And the architecture ran without her. It's about to run to completion. Underneath the talent and the precision and the command that made everyone believe she had earned the room, she's been doing one thing this entire time. She's been rooting the real threat outward. Every person who couldn't survive her standards became, in her account of herself, a person who couldn't survive her. The story she was running wasn't, I am carrying something I cannot see. It was, the world is full of people who cannot handle what I am. That story did real work. It kept the grief over Krista's death and the shame underneath it from ever needing to be looked at. Every relationship that fractured, every student who fell away, every colleague who went quiet. In the story, it all became more evidence of her rightness. That is a structure, and structures run. What is coming is not a breakdown, and not a powerful woman destroyed by people who wanted her gone. A structure that was never interrogated collides with the moment that actually needed a precise analysis and holds the story anyway. Lydia is under heavy pressure. People know that she is linked to Krista's death. The edited video has been traveling. The Juilliard Masterclass footage moving through editors into a press that frames it as a prepared narrative. Into parents' council, to protesters outside the building, to a board full of people making calculations she is not part of anymore. Just the openings the structure left, and a chain moving on its own logic. Sharon, Lydia's partner, confronts her. You didn't tell me, she says. You didn't ask me how to handle this. Not the way you did when you first arrived here. They are lies, Lydia tells her. Sharon presses.
These conversations took place in another bed. Or rather, the couch of that horrible place you still can't let go of.
How cruel of you to define our relationship as transactional.
That's not a defense. So Sharon replies back.
There's only one relationship you've ever had that wasn't. And she's sleeping in the room next door. Apparently this hasn't even crossed your mind.
She stands and moves off. By this point, Lydia feels deep down that she is losing everything she has worked so hard to get, and she is having difficulties to pretend that she doesn't care about it. Meetings she isn't invited to are happening. Her nightmares are becoming more frequent and strong. On her morning runs, she sees her performance posters torn off and painted over. One day, she goes to get Petra, but Sharon appears and takes the girl with her. Status, reputation, and family. The whole structure is going down. So the performance day arrives. She walks out onto the stage in what might be the worst internal state of her life. And the story is still running. I'm fine. I can do this. This is my stage, my score. She doesn't really see Elliot Kaplan at the podium. She body slams him off it. The music stops. He says her name, and she backhands him across the face.
Is my score.
Lydia, you're confused.
It's my score! You fucking little nothing!
She kicks him in the ribs, again and again. Security comes and pulls her away.
I'm fine.
Kaplan wasn't the threat. He was standing in the wrong place at the moment the architecture finally had an hour left to go, and the disproportion that had been accumulating across every manufactured grievance, every overridden signal, every story layer deflection, found him instead. My score is not a statement about Kaplan. The disproportion in those kicks was never proportional to the men on the stage. It was always measuring the gap between what was actually happening in her life and what she was willing to let the story say about it. The pressure that ended her didn't need a coordinated campaign. The fake video traveled on its own logic. The board made its own calculations. The social media backlash applied pressure with no real strategy behind it. Lydia made those openings, one story override at a time, across years. And they were still there when the wait arrived, with no coordinator and none of her skill required. That is what running to completion looks like. The campaign against her indeed happened. The people making decisions about her was also true. The power operating against her real. And it didn't need to be fabricated or inflated to do what it did. And the reason it found such complete purchase was not its scale or its coordination. It was because the structure that was supposed to read the room clearly had been running a different story for so long that when the moment actually required the read, there was nothing operational left to deliver it. What would have needed to change was always on the inside of the crack. What is the story you tell about the last thing that took you apart? where it came from, who was responsible, and what it said about you. How many people close enough to see it had a different view? And if they did, what did this story call that? Somewhere in you, there is something that has been landing harder than the cost warrants. Every story override gave it more room. By the time the weight arrives that actually breaks it open, the disproportion doesn't feel like a gap. It feels like the truth. And your overreaction meets it at that level. You won't feel it as a sin. You'll feel it as an outrage, or certainty, or grief so clean it doesn't question itself. There's something that lives between seeing it and escaping it, and if there's a move available at all, it starts there. Find the layer that's out of true. Resync the story, the feeling, the doing. Get them back into alignment and stop the same heat from landing in the same place. That's the move appearing in your mind, and it's wrong in a specific way. The layers do not resync on command. The story layer running a narrative your feeling layer stopped confirming years ago doesn't correct on a schedule you control. The timeline belongs to the structure. And reaching for, now that I can see it, I can fix it, is the same logic aimed one level higher, at the sim itself rather than at the original pattern. The belief that understanding is sufficient for change is exactly what let the sim stay hidden for as long as it did. It doesn't become true just because you point at it. The move this section carries is smaller and more specific. It is not a transformation. It's a maintained stance, and that's a humbler thing that it sounds. Keeping one accurate read of the same event operational under the pressure that would otherwise collapse it. Something hits you harder than the cause warrants. A comment that shouldn't register at that weight. A conversation that shouldn't produce that response. A setback that shouldn't feel life-ending, but it does. That size is the marker, and the move is simple and specific. Before the cause story closes, ask the layer question. Which of the three? The story you're running about what's happening, the feeling underneath it, the behavior you're already producing, just took the hit. That is your first move. It's not a fix-it, not which one, and what do I do next? Just ask before the interpretation locks. The timing is the whole thing. The cause story doesn't wait. It runs on all three layers simultaneously and arrives first. By the time it feels coherent enough to question, the feeling has already confirmed it and the behavior is already producing output that matches it. The window where the structural analysis can get in is narrow. The disproportion itself is the signal. It shows you the moment before the window closes. You might be thinking, what does this even do? And the answer to that is that the cause story no longer gets the monopoly. This proportion stops rooting outward and starts rooting back to the source instead. The pressure continues. It doesn't disappear. The conditions are still there. The desynchronization resolves on its own timeline, not yours. The seam is still there. What this keeps you doing is reading. It keeps the structural read operational under the life pressure that would otherwise collapse it. The moment when the cause story is loudest, most viscerally confirmed by everything the situation feels like. That's when the move has to happen. That's what it does. It doesn't close the seam. It doesn't synchronize the desynchronization. That's a different project on the structure's timeline. And this isn't it. What stops is the compounding. The seam stops widening from the inside. The cycle where each disproportionate hit gets explained outward. The fracture stays open. And the next pass hits harder in the same place. When you use this technique, the exploit cannot run that cycle. Your assessment starts returning accurate information about which layer just absorbed the hit. The question that was getting abandoned under pressure every time it mattered most. So what you carry out of this? The disproportionate impact. When something hits you harder than the cause warrants, is not evidence about the world out there. It's a lens about the gap. The size of what hit you has always been measuring the fracture, not the threat. That's what you carry out of this. One thing this video leaves open, catching the disproportion gets you to the layer questioned. But reading which of the three layers just absorbed the heat with enough precision to actually root the intervention requires a different diagnostic. One this video doesn't carry. My case study on the movie Past Lives has that answer and is appearing on your screen. This is one piece of a system. 75 axioms built to work together to reverse engineered consciousness, identity, and the ego. All of it is in this channel. If this way of looking at things is useful to you, subscribe and like the video. That's how we reach more people. Thank you for watching.